Guy, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm happy that my wife Loretta accompanied me on this trip. It makes it a better trip for me all the way around, since I spend so many days in Washington when she may not be there. But I thank the Oxford Union for inviting me to join in this occasion. You know, it can do funny things to one's ego to be invited to speak at the Oxford Union. When I received your invitation, I showed it to Loretta and my staff, and I said, can you believe it? It's the oldest, most honored debating society in the world, and they've asked me to speak. I said, think of the company I'll be in. And I rattled off the names of some of those who've stood in a spot just like this. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, Malcolm X, the Dalai Lama, Mother Teresa. I told one of my colleagues about that, and she said, it sounds like a good warm-up act. It is certainly that. But my wife and others did a little research and learned that last year you invited Anthony Scaramucci to speak to this group too. Mr. Scaramucci, of course, is remembered forever in Washington. He disputes the exact numbers of days, I'm told, but I think the record shows he had an historic 6-day tenure as President Trump's White House communications director. I'm sure his reflection on his 6-day career in public service was noteworthy. Over the years, Oxford has molded some of the great minds in modern history. Sir Christopher Wren, Thomas More, John Donne, Jonathan Swift, Dr. Samuel Johnson, John Locke, the list goes on, Adam Smith, Oscar Wilde, Lewis Carroll, Indira Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher, and of course the legendary Oxford scholar, Michael Palin. I don't know about you, but I know the world would be a poorer place indeed without Monty Python. Does that ring a bell with anyone here? Watching the news these days, I'm often reminded of one of the famous Monty Python skits, and you may remember it. A workman tells the mill owner that a machine in the mill is broken. The mill owner angrily says, how in the world could that happen? The exasperated worker says, I don't know, I'm just delivering a message. I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition. Suddenly, 3 15th century red-clad cardinals burst through the doors and announce, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise, surprise and fear. Well, let me tell you, almost no one expected Donald Trump to be president of the United States of America. And that includes, by many accounts, many senior members of the Trump campaign, possibly even Donald Trump himself. But here we are, 17 months into the most bizarre presidency in my nation's history. To be an American traveling overseas in the age of Trump is to be asked 2 questions over and over again. What were you thinking? And what's next? I hope today to give you answers to a few questions and to place what's happening in America in some perspective. Before we talk about President Trump, however, I want to talk about an earlier occupant of the White House. His name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His statue stands in Grosvenor Square in London, just outside the American Embassy. In 1948, in a time of great hardship and rationing in England, 190,000 British citizens donated 5 shillings apiece to pay for that statue. They raised the money in less than a week. It's hard today for many people to even imagine that that same hero who helped bring World War II to the right conclusion led a presidency in 1932 with many unanswered questions. It's hard to imagine how fearful Americans were when he took office in 1933 as our 32nd president. America had been beaten to its knees, not by war or invasion, but by a Great Depression that broke our nation's confidence. The American economic system was failing. Days before FDR's inauguration, the New York Stock Exchange suspended trading indefinitely. In the 3 years since the crash of the stock market, millions of American jobs had disappeared. Business investment had dropped 90%. The nation's unofficial employment rate was astronomical, and the official rate, 25%. In some areas, as high as 80%. More than 5,000 banks had failed. Money that people had spent a lifetime saving just disappeared. A reporter asked the great British economist John Maynard Keynes if there was any precedent for what had happened to the world economy. Keynes replied, yes, it lasted for 400 years. It was called the Dark Ages. There was a perception among many that democracy was too slow to deal with the dizzying pace of dangerous change. The Chicago journalist and author Jonathan Alter, a personal friend, wrote a book that captured the panic of the times. It's called The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. Many influential voices in America in 1933 called for nothing short of a benevolent dictator in the United States. In Jonathan Alter's words, a strong leader unfettered by Congress and the inconvenience of democracy. They pointed to Italy, where Benito Mussolini had seized power a decade earlier and revived the Italian economy. In Germany, on the very day Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States, German citizens ratified Chancellor Adolf Hitler's hold on power in a legal election. Around the globe, democracy appeared to be on the ropes. In researching his book, Alter found a long-lost copy of a speech which suggests that even FDR himself may have harbored private doubts about whether democracy was adequate to the crisis facing America. The night before he was inaugurated, FDR decided to give a speech to the American Legion, organization of veterans of World War I. In that lost speech, written by a member of his inner circle, the new president would claim the right to declare martial law, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of war veterans, apparently to guard banks and put down rebellions or do what's necessary to command any phase of the crisis. And the veterans, he would say in that speech, would be duty-bound to obey. Thankfully, at the last minute, Roosevelt decided against that speech. And rather than curtail democracy, he chose to energize it. In his first 100 days as president, FDR and his allies in Congress enacted dozens of major bills reviving the American economy, outlawing reckless speculation that caused the crash, creating the largest, most prosperous middle class the world has ever known. A Japanese diplomat negotiating his nation's surrender at the end of World War II offered a powerful testimonial on the ability of democracy. He said, "We were not beaten on the battlefield by dint of superior arms. We were beaten in a spiritual contest by a nobler idea." In the years following World War II, while an iron curtain descended over Eastern Europe, the United States, Great Britain, and our Western allies created new institutions to defend that nobler idea of democracy against a new form of tyranny, communism. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, NATO, the European Union were all parts of the shared global defense of democracy. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. In the long twilight struggle of totalitarianism and democracy, democracy had again prevailed. According to Pew Research, in the first 2 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the number of democracies in the world nearly doubled and now include almost 6 out of every 10 nations. Consider Latin America. Only a few decades ago, it was rife with military dictatorship. Now it is almost entirely democratic. On November 9th, 2017, 27 years to the day after the fall of Berlin Wall, Donald Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States. As you know, we have 2 major political parties in the United States, Republicans and Democrats. At times in the past, Mr. Trump has called himself a Democrat. He ran and was elected as a Republican. The truth is, his policies don't fit easily with either party. From day one of the Trump presidency, we've witnessed a nonstop tweet-fueled assault on the institutions and norms of American democracy. Many of those attacks are right out of an autocrat's handbook. I won't try to list them, but let me give you a few. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a senator from the state of New York I was proud to serve with, was a sociologist and diplomat, and a great intellectual and a funny man. During a debate in the Senate, he once famously told another senator, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts." That proposition is being tested by President Trump and those around him every single day. It started even before the campaign with his nagging insistence that President Obama was born in Kenya. It continued throughout the campaign. One infamous example, candidate Trump asserted that the father of one of his opponents for the Republican presidential nomination, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, That father was somehow involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. The Washington Post has been keeping a running tally of Trump's departures from truth. The last count was over 3,000 lies. That's more than 6 public lies a day. He is indeed a busy president. The day before America's presidential election, the Oxford Dictionaries announced its 2016 word of the year. The word was post-truth, an adjective defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Oxford's president of dictionaries, I hope I get a chance to meet someone with that title, said that the use of the word post-truth increased by 2,000% in the year 2016, fueled in large part by the Brexit debate here in the UK and the Republican presidential primary in the United States. On day 2 of the Trump presidency, a White House spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, coined a classic Orwellian term. She called the administration's outrageously inflated estimates of the crowd size at the president's inauguration as, quote, alternative facts. But democracy depends on citizens knowing and being able to debate real facts. Democracy can't survive in a political atmosphere where you can't tell truth from falsehood. President Trump is deliberately undermining public faith in the traditional arbiters of democracy, the institutions that exist to separate fact from fiction and hold those in power accountable. He's called the media, and I quote, the enemy of the American people. He dismisses any news that's critical of him as fake news, and his broadsides against the press appear to be working. According to a recent poll, 1/3 of all Americans and 2/3 of Trump supporters agree the media is in fact the enemy of the people. President Trump has questioned the integrity of federal judges and the authority of federal courts. 1 week into his presidency, when federal judges ordered an emergency stay of his ban on people from predominantly Muslim countries coming into the United States, the president was astonished and expressed it publicly that a judge had the power to overrule a president. He's denounced America's federal court system as broken, unfair, a joke, and a laughingstock. He attacks judges personally. He suggested that judges in the courts will be to blame for future terrorist attacks. This is not the design of a democracy. Impartial judges and an independent judiciary at the heart of our Constitution and laws. They depend on public trust and confidence for their legitimacy and authority. Oddly, one group the president refuses to criticize is the group that actually did attack the American democracy, the Russian military intelligence agencies that waged a cyber attack on our 2016 election. Loretta and I live in Illinois. Illinois was one of the first states that was hit by the Russians, and we announced it publicly. Most other states kept quiet. What happened was, and I'm a liberal arts lawyer, so forgive me if I don't take you very deeply into the internet and computers, but we left a little opening, and the Russians found it and went inside and had access to all of the voter information in the state of Illinois. They didn't change the ultimate outcome of the vote, but it was within their power to literally change addresses, so that if we showed up to vote and gave as our address, our home address in Springfield, they'd say, I'm sorry, that's not the address we have on the official records. They could have done that so easily and caused utter chaos across the United States. That is not even debated any longer as to whether it happened. Finally, concessions by almost everyone other than the president and the findings of major intelligence agencies tell us they were doing this all over the United States. The Russian interference was the most serious attack on America's national security since 9/11. U.S. intelligence agencies agree that meddling had an intent, a specific political intent, to harm Hillary Clinton and to elect Donald Trump, and sow division and chaos in America. Trump has called investigations into that Russian interference and whether there was any involvement by his campaign or anyone else a witch hunt. And he says it over and over and over again. He disparages the members of the CIA and the FBI as liars and leakers. The president sacked the head of the FBI when he refused to pledge loyalty to the Trump team, and then went on national TV and unabashedly admitted that was his strategy. 70 years ago, America helped create multilateral institutions and agreements that have protected the peace in Europe and beyond, spreading democracy and enhancing prosperity. Today is America's commitments to those institutions and to the very idea of working with other nations to advance shared interests is in doubt. questioning the value of NATO, withdrawing America from the Paris Climate Agreement. We are the only nation on earth that is not a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement, has strained our relationships with our closest allies. The decisions to pull the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear agreement unilaterally over the urgent pleas of Prime Minister May, Foreign Secretary Johnson, French President Macron, German Chancellor Merkel, and others raise serious questions about the involvement of the United States in alliances which have endured for decades. It'll also force Iran to work more closely with China and Russia, and I'm afraid it will make conflict in the region more likely, not less. So returning to the question that Americans are asked so often, what were we thinking when a majority, at least of the Electoral College, voted for Donald Trump? One writer aptly described the appeal of Trump to many Americans. They may not have agreed with or even know the positions he's taken. On some matters, they may even disagree with him, but they voted for him because they believed he would shake things up. As one writer put it, Trump was their own personal Molotov cocktail, aimed at a system they believed was stacked against them. I know statistics make your eyes glaze over, and maybe you have to put up with a lot of them in your classes, but bear with me for a few that I think reflect this. In the United States, the wealthiest 1% captured 95% of all the wealth created since the end of the financial crisis in 2009. During the same period, the bottom 90% became poor. The wealthiest 1% now own 35% of America's wealth, the poorest half 2.5%. There's more. Income inequality in America is now greater and more intractable than it was during the 1920s I described earlier. The chief executive officers of the 350 top American companies are paid 332 times more than their average workers. Wall Street bonuses alone are twice the amount of all combined earnings of minimum wage workers in the United States. In a poll 2 years ago, 71% of Americans said they believe the economy's rigged. 25% said they hadn't taken a vacation in more than 5 years. 71% said they were afraid of unexpected bills. And in my nation that I call home and love so much, 60% of the families in that nation do not have access to $1,000. 60%. $1,000, I can tell you, in America is one auto repair bill or one trip to a hospital emergency room away from everyone. Louis Brandeis, the eminent U.S. Supreme Court Justice, warned nearly a century ago, we can either have a democracy in this country or we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. Which brings me to this sobering finding, and unfortunately it plays out in other places beyond the United States. In a recent poll, 35%, more than 1 out of 3 of Americans, said they would give up their right to vote in elections for life, and more than 9% said they would also give it up for their children in exchange for a 10% increase in pay. If you listen closely, you hear the echoes of America in 1933. Unsure whether democracy can solve the crisis of our time and hoping for a strong man to get things right again, willing to sacrifice freedom for security. And we know that the doubts about liberal democracy today are not just limited to America. Former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who's been a guest here as well, has written a great book called Fascism, A Warning. In it, she tells her personal story of living under authoritarianism. Born in Czechoslovakia, 3 of her 4 grandparents perished as Jews in the Holocaust. Her parents raised their children as Christians to try to protect them from the Holocaust and death. Her own family survived the Holocaust by seeking refuge here in England. They returned home after the war only to be exiled again to America when the communists took over in Czechoslovakia. The foreword to her new book contains a haunting quote from the great Holocaust writer Primo Levi. He wrote, "Every age has its own fascism." In the 20th century, the struggle against fascism was against Hitler and Mussolini. Today, Albright writes, we are in a new era, testing whether the democratic banner can remain aloft amid terrorism, sectarian conflict, vulnerable borders, rogue social media, and the cynical schemes of ambitious men. The answer, she says, Madeleine says, is not self-evident. We are certainly aware of countries like Russia, Venezuela, Cambodia, Egypt, and others that conduct illegitimate elections in which opposition candidates and parties are banned or jailed or voting results are manipulated. I didn't mention this to Guy, but about 5 weeks ago I was in Caracas for 4 days. and met with Maduro before this last election just a week ago from today. He basically has banned any political party that is viable in his country and has put under house arrest or in penitentiary anyone who might run against him. And so he gets 70% of the vote in a rigged election. But that, unfortunately, is a more common occurrence, not just in South America, but in other places as well. Nations as varied as Turkey, Poland, and Hungary, anti-democratic leaders are emerging and winning democratic election. They use their victories to weaken the exact democratic institutions that let them win in the first place. In some cases, they're offering what they claim is a new kind of democracy, illiberal democracy, or what one political observer calls democracy without rights. There are elections, but there are no protections for minorities or dissent. Parties espousing this hollow form of democracy are on the rise in Germany, France, Austria, Netherlands, the Philippines, Syria, in the world's largest democracy, India, and elsewhere. Sadly, with his attacks on civic institutions and civil discourse, Donald Trump has emboldened authoritarian leaders around the world. Madeleine Albright identifies 4 conditions that are needed in order for authoritarianism to threaten and topple a democracy. First, rapid technological and social change, coupled with economic anxiety and gaping economic inequality. Second, authoritarian regimes, exploiting grievances over perceived lost glory, make America great again, and promising a return to national greatness. Third, authoritarian regimes are nationalistic. They act in their own narrow self-interest rather than with other nations to advance interest. President Trump has revised the old isolationist slogan of America first. Finally, importantly, fascism always needs an enemy, internal or external. For authoritarianism to take root, there needs to be a perceived threat to national identity and security threat from outsiders, Jews, gypsies, migrants, Muslims. 17 years ago, I introduced a bill in the United States Senate entitled the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act was created because of a basic injustice where children, infants, toddlers brought to the United States without the necessary documentation grew up in America, pledged allegiance to our flag in a classroom every single day, and dreamed about a future that included America and no other country because they knew no other country. And we discovered 17 years ago a Korean girl in Chicago who unfortunately was undocumented, and as gifted as she happened to be, the laws of the United States, as currently written, required her to leave the United States for 10 years and petition to come back in, despite the fact she'd grown up here. I've tried over and over again, so many times I can't tell you, to pass this legislation. Almost 90% of the American people favor it, Republicans and Democrats alike. I didn't anticipate what happened in this last election. When Donald Trump decided to start calling Mexicans rapists and started talking about building a wall and started blaming immigrants right and left for terrorism and threats of terrorism, there was a sentiment growing within his political party which has been difficult for me to cope with in the United States Congress. Many Republicans who privately tell me they support my bill are worried back home of what will happen to them in a primary if they go back home having voted for the DREAM Act. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to keep trying. But it breaks my heart to see all of these young people, 790,000 of them who had registered under the DACA program, who now have absolute uncertainty as to their lives. One quick story. There's a College of Medicine in Chicago at Loyola University called Stritch College of Medicine. They did something without anyone urging them that was amazing. They decided 4 years ago that they would open up competition for their medical school to these undocumented young students. No special slots, no quotas, you're just in the pool competing. They ended up accepting 30 of these DACA students into their medical school, a dramatic commitment on their part. There's some 58 nationwide, 30 are at Loyola at the Stritch College of Medicine. I went there 2 weeks ago. There's a little rite of passage for doctors called Match Day, where they have sent out applications to become residents in some specialty after they finish their first 4 years of medical school in the United States. It's one of the biggest days in their lives as to whether or not they're being picked up for an internship in their specialty that they want to dedicate their lives to. And as they open the envelopes, it's a tense moment. Not everyone gets accepted. Out of the six DACA students accepted by Loyola School of Medicine, 4 matched, 2 were turned down, and the explanation was in the letter: since Congress has not reauthorized DACA, we're not certain you could legally work at our hospital or university as an intern, and we can't accept you. There they are, after all those years and all that effort, with literally no future because the Congress has been stopped cold by a president who insists on a 2,000-mile wall. Today, immigration is the gasoline on the fire of fascism. Political leaders with authoritarian impulses are trying to advance their agenda by casting immigrants as scapegoats and threats. Syrian war refugees in Germany, African economic migrants in Italy, Mexican and Central American immigrants in the United States, and EU immigrants in England. On January 11th, I was in the Oval Office, one of 12, meeting with President Trump, when he asked angrily why America accepted so many immigrants and refugees from countries like Haiti and from the continent of Africa. That's when he used the words S-hole countries, which have haunted him since, and they should. I was stunned to hear that language in the Oval Office of the White House. I thought to myself, and I just knew I was wrong. Surely no president has ever said anything quite like this. Well, I'm afraid there might have been someone in the past that did it, but I couldn't believe in the 21st century that I was hearing those words from this president. My mother was an immigrant to America. She came at the age of 2 from Lithuania. And when I heard the president's hateful record about immigrants and refugees, it hit home. It hit me personally. But I'm not unique. My story, my family story, is America's story. That's who we are. That's what we're all about. You know, we all have some pride in where our parents came from, but we pledge allegiance to one flag. We call ourselves Americans first, and we are. But there is now a pall over immigration in this great nation of the United States that I worry about and what it means. Today's global refugee problem may feel overwhelming, but it's nothing compared to the refugee crisis our nations will face in 10 or 20 years if we fail to address the threats that are pushing so many people away from their own lands. Climate change, conflict, corruption, poverty, lethal global pandemics, all are problems that can only be solved through sustained, enlightened, and cooperative action. The President's party holds the majority in both the House and the Senate, and regrettably the majority so far has failed to demand accountability from this President or challenge his incivility or his autocratic impulse. But thank goodness other institutions and the American people are pushing back. One recent poll estimated that 4 in 10 Americans participated in a political protest during President Trump's first year in office. For many, it was the first time they'd ever done it. The brave survivors of Parkland High School in Florida came out of that shooting massacre and rallied millions of Americans to demand stronger gun safety laws. We're not going to pass them with this Congress as it's currently politically constructed. But I can tell you the forces are growing in our country for the kind of change we desperately need. In closing, I'll leave you with one last thought from Franklin Roosevelt. In his first inaugural address in the midst of America's gravest crisis since the Civil War, Roosevelt acknowledged only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. But then he said, and we've heard it so many times, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Roosevelt knew that hope is more powerful than fear. Fear divides and hope unites. Fear can cause us to see threats that don't even exist and to see phantom enemies even in our own ranks. Fear tells us we can't win unless we abandon our principles. Hope says we can't lose unless we abandon our ideals. Fear can provoke outbursts of action, but sustained action, the kind of action that's needed to meet formidable challenges of today, can only come from hope. Thank you, Oxford Union. Now I'll do my best to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Senator, for a fascinating speech. I will ask a few questions before opening up to the audience. So, Senator, you became the founding chairman of the Senate's Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law. One of its key areas is scrutinizing human rights abuses in the criminal justice system. So President Obama was the first president since President Carter to actually leave office with fewer people in prison than when he came into office. And under the current administration, there are several threats to Obama's achievements, in particular as a result of Attorney General Jeff Sessions' actions. Could you comment on the work you've been doing to fight back?
I'm going to say some words that I doubt any speaker has ever used at the Oxford Union, certainly not an American politician. Let me tell you about the worst vote I ever cast as a member of Congress. Didn't expect to hear that, did you? But I'll tell you what it was. It was about 25 years ago, and I was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And they came to us and they said, there's a new narcotic on the street. It's called crack cocaine. It's cheap. It's $5. It's deadly addictive. And if a pregnant woman takes it, she'll harm her fetus in ways unimaginable. At about the same time, there was a basketball player at the University of Maryland named Len Bias. He was a superstar, destined for the NBA. He died from an overdose. What we did in Congress next is unimaginable and led to my worst vote. We decided to take crack cocaine, unlike powder cocaine, and make the criminal sentencing guidelines 100 times what it was for powder cocaine. 100 times. And we said, that'll tell everyone across America how serious we are. We're going to get tough on this. Don't mess with crack cocaine. Don't even consider it. What happened? As a result of increasing it 100 times, we started filling the prisons of America with those who weren't involved in violent crime. They were involved in drug possession and drug sales. And overwhelmingly, they were African Americans. It was the drug of choice in African American communities. In addition to that, we didn't make a dent in the narcotics trade or in the drug epidemic. Prices on the street kept going down. The number of users kept going up. All this get tough law and order 100-to-1 stuff just turned out to be a waste of time, and even worse, a waste of human lives, of people who were incarcerated. I knew that when I got elected to the Senate. And I thought back on that and thought, Durbin, that was the dumbest thing you've ever done as an elected official. You've got to change it. So I introduced a bill that changed it from 100-to-1 to 1-to-1. There was just no demonstrated difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. All the stories were anecdotal that we used to motivate ourselves to do these things. And my nemesis, my opponent in this, turned out to be a senator from Alabama named Jeff Sessions. This is not easy, my friends, to negotiate with Jeff Sessions on criminal sentencing. But I went after him in every way imaginable. Religious leaders in Alabama, I sent him in to see Sessions. Everybody I could think of, talk to him, see if we can get him to come down from 100-to-1. So the day came for our Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, and I ran into him in the Senate gym. I go there every morning for no apparent reason, but I go to the Senate gym, and that's a joke. And I run into him and I said, Jeff, we've got to get this done. It's 100-to-1 is wrong. I know. All right, I'll give you 25-to-1. And I said, come on, Jeff, 10-to-1. This is how laws are made. 10-to-1. No, I can't do 10-to-1. He held the power to make that decision. I said, give me a number. He said, 18. And that's what it is. We wrote the law together. We passed it in the Senate, passed it in the House. It was signed in a private ceremony by President Obama. Tens of thousands of prisoners were able to petition and to leave jail, prison. The worst case, a friend of mine in Chicago had been sentenced to life in prison for the third strike of selling crack cocaine. Alton Mills was released after spending 23 years in prison. Never committed a violent crime, but the third strike of selling crack cocaine. So we're moving slightly in the right direction. I've got another bill. My ally this time, equally unlikely, but very good, is Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Chuck Grassley's in his 80s, a conservative Republican corn farmer from Iowa, and by God, I got him on my side this time. And what we're trying to do is to change the mandatory minimum sentencing. That was put in the law to tie the hands of judges so that when they had a defendant in front of them, they had no choice. 5 years is the mandatory minimum. I can't go below it, no matter what you did. And we listed all these crimes. Well, it turns out judges came to us and said, "You guys are crazy. Some of these people have never done anything wrong before. They'll never do it again. Why are we putting them in jail for 5 years? Give us a little flexibility. That's what the bill does. So we do have this possibility coming forward. And even last week on the floor, I stood with Mitch McConnell and Cornyn, Republican leaders, and Grassley, and said, I'm willing to try to do this again if you will let us bring it to the floor. I don't know. I just don't know if Trump will buy it. I just don't know. The one thing we have going for us is Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, his father went to prison for a year. And Kushner, in most every conversation with every member of the Senate, brings that up instantly. He doesn't run away from it. He talks about it. And he says, I want to do something about the people in prison. So there's a chance, just a chance, that we might be able to move him and his father-in-law towards something when it comes to this.
Thank you. So in 2016, many claimed that economic anxiety helped drive millions of working class whites from the Democrats to Donald Trump. What steps have the Democratic Party in general, and more in particular the DNC, taken to ensure that you bring them back in the upcoming midterm elections?
Here's the tough truth. Unless you have a candidate for president who is your figurehead, is carrying your banner for your party, we have a Mormon Tabernacle chorus of Democratic politicians, all vying to get on MSNBC, all wanting to be on Meet the Press, all making speeches on the floor. And it's hard as hell to get a focus, and it's harder even still to get the American people to pay attention to one person or so. I'm going to give my wife credit here the other day, and I think she's right. Bernie Sanders does pretty well in this environment, you know? We know where Bernie comes from, and unabashed, he's right where he was first time I ever met the guy, in his values and his explanation of political issues. He's more articulate and clearer than most, and he brings it down to issues that we think kind of fit into the question that Guy asked here. What is that we can say that workers across our country will think the Democrats get it? All the statistics I gave you about economic inequality, what are we doing about it? Well, first, I voted for a lot of trade agreements, not all of them. Some of them stink. Some of them we need to revisit. Some of them need to be rewritten. Trump's going to get some credit for that, but we better be on the right side of history when it comes to rewriting some of these agreements. I'm for expanded trade, but I'm also for trade agreements, sound principles, and enforcement of that as well. That's an important part of it. Then there are other things we do as Democrats which Republicans don't sign up for. One of them is to expand training and education for people to become the workers of tomorrow. We're just not doing enough of that. And I would much rather have seen the money we wasted on the Republican tax reform bill put into that.
Thank you. So in the recent high-profile case of the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal, you stated that maybe what this was all about is our right to privacy and the limits to our right to privacy. Part of your role in the subcommittee involves examining the role of American technology companies in promoting global internet freedom. Do you think the United States will be ready to prevent foreign interference and cyber attacks in upcoming elections? And what role do you think data polling will have?
Well, Mark Zuckerberg came and appeared before our hearing, and it was a joint hearing with the Senate Judiciary Committee and Government Affairs Committee. 44 senators were asking him questions, and he was well prepared for what he had to face. And they even got him a 3-inch cushion to sit on, so he got more stature. And all these questions came in, and came my turn, and I was like the 14th or 15th person, and I said, let me ask you this, Mr. Zuckerberg, would you feel uncomfortable telling the committee on the record where you stayed, what hotel you stayed in last night? And he completely dissembled in front of me. It was like, that was a question nobody prepared him for. And he finally said, no, I wouldn't feel comfortable telling you that. And I said, well, let me ask you this. Would you feel comfortable telling us in this committee, for the record, the names of people that you sent messages to and mailed to in the last few days? No, he said, I wouldn't. I said, isn't that what this is all about? That kind of information is readily available through your company by our activities on the internet, the things that we do. I guess the question I would pose goes back to the audience, because I think this is a generational question which you have to answer. My wife and I, no, forget it. I was raised she's much younger. I was raised in a generation that viewed privacy differently than people do today. I'll give you an illustration. How many of you have ever been in a telephone booth? A couple people. Okay. Gray hair. We used to have these little closets with the telephone inside. You know why? Because when we wanted to get into a telephone conversation, we didn't want anybody else to hear it. We wanted to talk to the person on the other end of the line, and we wanted to do it in private. Now what happens when your plane's wheels touch the tarmac and land? Automatically, I'm learning what the woman next to me is fixing for dinner tonight for her husband. I'm learning what the folks in front of me, what troubles they're having with their kids in school, and behind me, whether they can ever manage to have another successful visit with the in-laws. I know more stuff about people that I don't need to know, and I don't think I should know. But people seem to be much more open about, oh, I don't care, take it if you want it. I went to buy a pair of shoes in Chicago, and they said, we'll give you a 20% discount. Give us your email address. Well, I haven't set up a phony email address. And I said, I'm not going to give it to you. He said, you don't get the discount. So what they're doing is bargaining away our individuality, our identity in the process. And they're going to continue to do this unless and until this generation stands up and says, we're going to draw a line here. There's a point beyond which you cannot go. Cambridge Analytica was a good illustration. 80, 90 million identities compromised, thrown into this political brew that they were putting together there. The company's gone out of business, but you know what they were up to. What can we do? Well, it turns out Europe is ahead of us. What Europe announced just this last week really came up with some principles which we in the United States, I think, should start seriously taking a look at. I'm glad they're doing this. Maybe the Europeans are going to show some leadership here that we can follow. But I think this is an issue which could grow if younger Americans decide to pitch in and make it their cause.
Thank you. My final question before I open up to the audience. So Senator, you've recently tweeted that in the first 21 weeks of 2018, there have been 23 school shootings in which someone has been hurt or injured. Following Parkland, many thought that would become a big violence issue for the upcoming midterm elections. What do you think it will take for lawmakers in America to start taking gun control and gun reform seriously?
I really thought that Newtown in Connecticut would be the tipping point, as Gladwell says in his book. When somebody walks into a first grade classroom, and we have first grade grandkids, so I mean it just breaks my heart to even say the words, and starts killing these kids wantonly with military type weapons, it's an outrage. And our little 6-year-old first grader came back from her school in Brooklyn, New York, and told her mom, who is careful not to expose our little granddaughter to a lot of the violence on television and stuff. She said, Mom, the teacher told us that if there's a shooter in my school, I'm supposed to stay away from the windows and get down on the floor. First grade in America. Does anybody in their wildest dreams think that's what the Second Amendment's all about? I mean, whether you believe in the militia part or personal freedom on the issue, we have reached this point that is beyond description. The current Congress, as politically constructed, will not change this. Will not change this. There is a mortal fear, particularly among Republicans, that the National Rifle Association will take them out in a primary. So they refuse to consider any changes, any changes. In fact, they're pushing for liberalizing gun laws instead of coming down with some basic and fundamental things. The American people are overwhelmingly for sensible gun safety, overwhelmingly for it. And what we've got to do is to get the Parkland kids registered and high school kids across America registered and tell them, you got to start working for people who agree with your point of view. Last point I'll make, I went to the NBC building to do a TV show on MSNBC, and I ran into this one young fellow from Parkland. And so I went up to him and I said, I've seen you on TV a lot, just want to congratulate, David Hogg is his name, just want to congratulate you on what you're doing. And he said, you ever take any money from the NRA? I thought, well, I've sure impressed him a lot. He's quizzing me right off the bat. And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, where do you get your money? I said, well, most Democrats do, but I don't take them from gun lobby. He said, okay. And he walked away, and I thought, okay, that's what politicians are supposed to put up with. People who ask you hard questions. If he keeps asking that question, others ask the same question and start voting accordingly, then we may see a change.
Thank you. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you. Stand up and project your voice, please. So for the first question, we'll go to the gentleman in the blue shirt.
How confident are you in the prospects of sentencing and prison reform, given that the House wants to separate the two issues and the Senate Judiciary Committee is trying to keep them together?
Well, you're on top of the issue, and that's the problem. The House has passed a prison reform measure, and it divided the House Black Caucus. You had Congressman Jeffries, African-American, supporting it, sponsoring it. Cedric Richmond, the chairman of the House Black Caucus, also supporting it in committee. And then my dear friend and icon, as far as I'm concerned, John Lewis, opposing it, and others as well. And it gets down to this argument. In the age of Trump, take what you can get, is what many of them are arguing. We seem, I feel, and share the feelings of John Lewis, that this is not, it's not much, and it's a poor excuse for what we should be doing when it comes to prison reform. And it relies too much on the warm heart of Jeff Sessions and finances coming in to the project through OMB, which are unlikely. So anyway, it passed, and it passed healthily. There were like 60 votes against it in the House. That's the day it passed. I went over to McConnell and said, all right, we're willing to sit down and merge that bill with some changes and our bill on sentencing into a package if you'll let us bring it to the floor. If you tell us we don't have time, we can't do it, I'm not going to waste my time on it. I mean, it would be a waste of time. And he did not make a firm commitment he would bring it to the floor, but in the presence of many of his colleagues, he was open to it, said, show me what you can do in terms of support. And that's what we're trying to do now.
Thank you. Next question will go to the lady in the third row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Maya. I'm an American PhD student here, and I'm writing my PhD dissertation on congressional committees. So I'm very excited to hear from you because you've actually been on 3 of the 4 committees that I focus on, House Agriculture, House Science during your time in the House, and Senate Foreign Relations. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment generally on how you've been shaped by the witnesses who have come to speak to you in those committees, how you've learned from them, how they've changed your mind, and maybe how this has varied by committee, by chamber over time, and the related issue of questioning the witnesses. I know that Time Magazine a few years ago dubbed you the debater for your tough questioning style. So the way in which you use your 5 minutes of questioning to engage with the witnesses.
Well, most of the time, the witnesses before a committee in Congress, the list is stacked. The senator, congressman who calls the hearing usually has an agenda, either to pass a bill or defeat a bill, and will call witnesses which support that point of view. Many times they'll open up for a couple minority witnesses, and that gives a little more interest to it and a little more information. But too many times it's a waste of space. You already know what the Heritage Institute's going to do with this bill. You already know what the Federalist Society has to say about this judge. I mean, it's very predictable in that regard. But you know, I still think it's an important exercise for members to hear one another ask questions and see where they're going. And sometimes that leads to interesting developments. Remember what I told you about my worst vote ever? Well, right now we're facing the same proposal, not on crack cocaine, but on fentanyl. If you follow our drug crisis in America, the worst we have ever had in our history, it starts with a prescription for an opioid pill, then an addiction, then the price is too high, and heroin selling for $5 a shot. And heroin does the trick for a little while, but then it doesn't give you the same high, so you're getting more and more intensity in it, and then you feed in fentanyl, which can be made in a laboratory, doesn't need to be grown in a field in South America. And now you got a deadly combination. And now they're talking about putting these dramatic increases in sentencing on fentanyl. And when I like Lindsey Graham, he and I work on the DREAM Act. I like John Kennedy of Louisiana, Republican. He and I have worked on opioids. And I basically said to him, we've tried this, we've seen this movie, we know how this ends, this doesn't work. It makes us feel good as politicians to go home and say, I got tough on these things. But that exchange was taking place at a committee hearing that was stacked against me. But at the end of it, there was a conversation. So there's a lot that happens off the record if members really do talk to one another.
Thank you. Next question will go to the person just next to. Yep.
Hi, I have two quick questions. First, in your time in the Senate, television cameras were introduced to the floor. And do you think that the introduction of television cameras have made any impact on the way people behave? And secondly, I have a question about norms. You talked about the erosion of norms in the Senate. The Democrats will not be in the minority forever. Hopefully it'll only be 6 more months or so. Are you, in the rest of the caucus, you'll forgive me if I call you in the old guard here, are you cognizant of the idea that you're going to have to return to norms rather than maybe an expansion of those erosion to kind of, take your vengeance on and change the way that things have been operating over the last few years? Thank you.
TV cameras first. They predated me by a few years. The House got them first, and I was over in the House. The Senate waited. Bob Byrd and other old guard members fought it for a while and then gave up and said, we're going to do it. It changes the chamber for sure. I mean, we're all sensitive to the fact that even though the chairs are empty and the gallery's sparsely populated, it's going out over C-SPAN. And somewhere, someplace, someone suffering from insomnia is listening to my speech, And so I have a tendency, because the floor is usually empty, and I'm speaking to a presiding officer who's usually reading something that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I do something most senators don't do, and some of my colleagues think it's great and others can't stand it. I look at the camera. I'm talking to these folks, people here. Let me tell you why I'm giving the speech here. I've done 114 dreamer profiles, bringing colored photos to the floor, saying, don't listen to the numbers, meet these young people. And I just trying to tell the story so that folks get beyond immigration into the reality of life for each one of them. So I think it has an important value to it, but we do play to cameras. It's a natural instinct and you shouldn't ignore them. And in a democracy, it's probably healthier to do that than the opposite, as far as that's concerned. The only way we're going to get back to the Senate that I remember, and I sure hope we do, is by changing some laws prospectively, rules prospectively, and saying we don't know who's going to win the election in 2020, but starting in 2021, here's what we're going to do. We don't know who's going to have the majority at that point. I think that's the only way to make significant changes that might work when both sides are uncertain as to whether they'll be in the majority and are trying to come up with something that makes sense for the institution.
Thank you. Next question will go to the hand just over there.
Thank you. In your speech, you talked about alternative facts and post-truth society. And most of us here are at Oxford, we're kind of devoting our lives to looking for facts and searching for truth. And I was just wondering what you think is the role of scientists in fighting this post-truth society.
I made a statement on the floor of the Senate, I'll bet a dozen times. And I've said this. I believe the Republican Party of the United States of America is the only major political party in the world today that denies climate change. And if I'm wrong, come to the floor and tell me. No one ever has. And finally, one Republican member, I think there's a party in Australia. So, I mean, what I'm telling you is science is no longer enough when it comes to political decision on things like climate change. And I'm afraid it's going to lapse into other areas as well. And it troubles me. John McCain is on his last leg. He's a wonderful man. We've worked together over the years, came to the House together so many years ago. And there was a time when John McCain and Joe Lieberman co-sponsored the climate change bill. It was a bipartisan bill by two people who were close friends and respected one another. And now we can't find a single Republican who'll step up and talk about climate change. Not at all. And that to me is tragic, because I think some of the things we're doing to this planet, our kids are going to pay for over and over again. But we can't give up on it. We really have to stick with science. We get caught up in it sometimes. I mean, think about this for a second. Foreign Affairs magazine last month had an article on of all things on something called CRISPR. Anybody heard of CRISPR? CRISPR, a woman named Jennifer Doudna, who is a microbiology professor at Berkeley in California, is finding a way to edit DNA. And it's significant. it's working with plants, it's working with animal genetics, and now she says, we're not generations away, we're not decades away, we're years away from doing this to cure problems that people have. Example, a couple comes in to see me from Lake Forest, Illinois. She had been sickly most of her life and undiagnosed. At age 50, they figured out she had what's called myotonic dystrophy, a form of muscular dystrophy. And then they told her the bad news. It's genetic. You pass this on to your son and daughter, and she had. And they're in worse shape than she's in. If you could edit her DNA, you could stop what's happening to her. You could stop this from being passed to the next generation. That is the potential. It is just amazing, the potential. But it raises some fundamental questions, really fundamental questions. We don't do this kind of gene experimentation in the United States on embryos for obvious reasons. If you just didn't want to remove the myotonic dystrophy gene, the one letter that's wrong, but instead said, and while we're in there, this family could use a little help when it comes to future heart disease. Let's fix that too. And while we're there, you know, and then you're saying, now wait a minute, now we've gone into a new area. Now who's going to be the arbiter on that? I talked about the arbiters of democracy. Congress. Congress will be the arbiter on that. And take a look at Congress. If you don't start with the premise of science and start with some other premise, then I don't know how you get to the right conclusion and really answer the fundamental questions that we're faced here. But the next president, whoever it is, I hope is someone who loves science, respects science, and really sets out to restore its reputation.
Thank you. We have time for 2 or 3 more questions, so we'll go to the hand all the way in the back.
When you first mentioned Donald Trump, everyone burst out laughing, including myself. Now, the guy is an embarrassment to the US, clearly not fit for office, but do you think that historians might look kindly on his presidency if he does bring lasting peace to Korea?
Listen, he deserves credit for things that he's accomplished, even though I obviously don't agree with him on many things. Bringing prisoners back from North Korea, I applauded him, said, good. I tried to do that when I was down in Caracas. They just released an American on Saturday that I was trying to get. So we should, I feel, Democrats should be very honest about this. When he does something right, for God's sake, stand up and say so. If he ended up denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula and they said, what about the Nobel Peace Prize? I'd say, why not? You know, after 70 years of conflict or more, if he achieved it. Having said that, though, this whole process was upside down. You don't start with the principals meeting at the first meeting. Diplomacy, really, if it's done properly, is done behind scenes for the longest time with give and take and ups and downs and happiness and anger going back and forth behind the scenes until they finally come to a place where they think both sides have agreed, then step in the principles. Now, can you fashion a meeting with Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, meeting for the first time face-to-face over this issue? Obviously, it's fallen apart, at least for the moment, but you know, I struggle to try to imagine how. I've been in a meeting with this president, several meetings with this president. I cannot imagine how this would unfold, where it would go to. But if he achieves it, if he gets it done, we should give him credit. Everyone should give him credit. This is a dramatic change, you know, in the world, moving us toward peace and diplomacy.
Thank you. Next question. We will go to the hand about halfway up.
Hi, my name's Karishma. In your discussion on the Cambridge Analytica and the private data that these internet multinational corporations have access to, you mentioned how it is a scary idea that they have access to this private data. But how do you see the position of the Congress changing to these internet multinational corporations' access to private data when it comes to the data of terrorists and in the field of counterterrorism?
Well, first, when it comes to this privacy question, I am old school. I'm an opt-in guy. I don't believe you should automatically be surrendering your information. Now, I know what they give us to read, pages and pages that none of us read, you know, accept or deny at the end there to move forward on something. But I think we've got to be more sensitive to a basic fundamental question of surrendering our privacy. When it comes to issues of national security, you know, the standard has been quite different. It isn't a matter of protecting someone who is out to kill everyone in this room. It's a matter of finding a legal means of acquiring information that may keep people safe. You know, and each one of our countries and societies struggle with what that legal means might be. But we have to be good when it comes to gathering information. The United States, I've been on some committees that have worked with these agencies, have some remarkable things going on in this world. And Great Britain has been our ally in virtually all of it, trying to intercept terrorist activity before it harms people. And I will have to tell you, after 9/11, I was afraid it would be 9/11 every other month. And it hasn't been. It's bad enough what has happened. I'm not taking it lightly. But I think we ramped up the intelligence side to gather information and got a lot more countries cooperating with us in developing that information. And I would say when it comes to that security, it's a fine line because some people misuse private information in the names of security. But I think we've got to be using legally what we can to gather this information.
Thank you. We have time for one final question, and we will go to the hand all the way in the back.
Thank you. As you hinted in your talk, one of the reasons for Trump's election seems to have been a widespread feeling among the American people that Congress is ineffective and struggles to get things done. Why do you think it is that the American people hold such negative opinions of Congress? And do you think that yourself and your colleagues need to take some responsibility for the election of Trump for that reason?
First, it is a legitimate American pastime to jump all over my bones. I mean, really is. That's what our country is all about. And man, if you don't have a tough mental hide, don't take this job for a living. Because a lot of people pat you on the back and some will kick you in the butt. And that's what happens, and it should. There's nothing wrong with that. And some of it's painful, it hurts, but you know, you better just stiff upper lip, stay calm as they say, and move on. Because that's what America is all about. What really has changed things dramatically is, like guns, we've gone to extremes on financing campaigns. The Citizens United Supreme Court case basically said that corporations have a right to free speech, and the expression of that speech is in the money they spend. So when they spend money as corporations supporting a candidate or a cause, they're exercising their First Amendment rights to free speech. I think that is complete hogwash. I don't buy that at all. But that is what's driving what's going on today. We are seeing not only greater sums of money pouring into political campaigns, we are also seeing dark money, where huge amounts are being spent with no disclosure whatsoever. No disclosure. And I think that is destroying the American political system. I don't know how to unwind that. Short of a Supreme Court changing that fundamental decision on Citizens United, I don't think there's a way to do it. I often say that in American politics there are two classes of people. There are the multimillionaires and the mere mortals. And I've been in the mere mortal category my whole life, which means you spend more time than you could ever imagine calling strangers on the phone and begging for money. You wouldn't believe how much time goes into that. And it's not healthy. It's not healthy in a democracy. The campaigns are way too long, dramatically too expensive. And I think that brings American people to the point of view, they say they're all doing it. You know, you can't trust anybody. They're all captives of some special interest. And I've got the public financing bill. I can't get a single Republican to co-sponsor it. We used to have one, Arlen Specter, then he changed parties and became a Democrat and then passed away. But I think public financing is the way to go. The only two things that might lead to it, change the Supreme Court and a public scandal that is so overwhelming the American people say, that's it, you got to change it. But we have not quite reached that point.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but please join me in thanking Senator Dick Durbin for joining us.